Hi guys, welcome to another episode of U.S. History with Lennox, and today we're talking the Cold War. Now in our previous video, we looked at how a competition between the United States and the Soviet Union grew out of World War II. And this competition was based on two very different ideologies. On the American side, it was about democracy and capitalism, whereas the Soviet Union was focused on communism. Each side was worried and fearful that the other would come in and try to impose their ideology on them. And this created this tension between our two nations that is going to expand across the entire globe. The fear was that the communists were trying to expand their influence into Western Europe. We already saw evidence of that as World War II came to an end. We knew that Stalin wanted to take control of buffer nations between the Soviet Union and Germany. What we didn't realize was he was going to impose his government on those nations. We called those nations satellite nations, and they became part of the Soviet bloc. Well, to prevent more Soviet expansion, we took actions such as the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, all geared towards helping a war-ravaged world to prevent the Soviets from moving into those territories. Another action that we took was the formation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now you can see on this map how many countries are actually part of this alliance. Including the United States, you also had Great Britain and France, West Germany, Belgium, Spain, Greece, Turkey, all forming together to help protect Western Europe from a Soviet aggressive movement. But we weren't alone. The Soviets also formed an alliance called the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was an alliance between the Soviets and all those satellite nations that they had occupied after World War II. And they are going to rival the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The bottom line is, going into the 1950s, the Cold War was expanding. It's not just between the US and the Soviets now. It's becoming a global competition. Now, while we were focused on Western Europe after the war, the Soviets were also looking to expand in other parts of the world. And one place they went to was Asia. There had been a conflict within China between two competing powers. The nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, and the Chinese communists, led by Mao Zedong. You had a civil war that was being fought in China, and quite honestly, though the United States provided aid to the nationalists to help prop them up, the communists are going to take the upper hand. China will be divided. 1949, Mao Zedong is going to declare that China is indeed a communist state and names it the People's Republic of China. Chiang Kai-shek, though, doesn't go away quietly. He goes away, but he goes to Taiwan, where he sets up a Chinese nationalist government. So it's almost like you had two separate Chinese governments, both claiming control of the nation itself. The communists had taken over mainland China. And what we're going to see is when we look at a map, it felt like communism had control of more than half the world. And they're not stopping with China. There's going to be a movement to take communism into Korea right at the beginning of the 1950s. And I'll talk about that here in just a little bit. But as this is happening, Republicans are looking at Truman and saying, what's going on? How did this happen underneath our nose? And they blamed him for China falling into communist hands. What we start to see as a result of all of this is an arms race is going to start building in the world. Our U.S. military is going to start expanding. In 1947, we passed the National Security Act, under which 3 new agencies are going to be created, including the Department of Defense, the CIA, and the National Security Council. We're looking at our military now not just as a defender of American shores, but as a tool to defend the world from communism. In 1950, NSC, standing for National Security Council Report number 68, is going to do a military, economic, political, and social study on the Soviet Union and China. And the conclusion they came to was that communism was this fanatical movement, and it was a true threat, a permanent threat to the world. Within this report, the United States pledged to intervene in stopping the spread of communism in the world. It basically confirms the Truman Doctrine and is going to become the foundational document and policy of the Cold War for the next 20 years. It's a very important document. I mentioned an arms race is going to start to grow out of the Cold War. In 1945, the United States used the first atomic weapon. But we weren't the only ones trying to create one. And in 1949, the Soviets are going to be just a step behind us when they created their own nuclear weapon. And now the race is on. In 1952, the United States is going to up the ante when we create our first hydrogen bomb. This bomb is 1,000 times stronger than what we dropped in Hiroshima. Not to be outdone, the Soviets create their own in 1953. And this race is going to continue for the next 30 years. We went into what was referred to as mutually assured destruction. And quite honestly, it's this idea, I think, that prevented the Cold War from becoming an actual war being fought. Mutually assured destruction, or MAD, is this military theory that neither side will attack the other because we recognize with the power of the weapons that we each have, it really doesn't matter who fires first. We were all going to be destroyed if nuclear weapons would ever be used. That's why it's called mutually assured destruction. All it took was one of us to use our bomb and we would all be destroyed. But the Cold War is not going to go away. Just because we recognize that we can destroy each other doesn't mean we stop the competition. I mentioned Korea before. Following World War II, Korea had actually been divided in half along the 38th parallel. The Soviets took control of North Korea, and the Allies in the United States took control of South Korea. And we had actually set up a democratic government in South Korea. The problem ensued when both governments of North and South Korea claimed control over all of Korea. And what's going to happen is the Korean War, which actually wasn't a war because we never really declared it, but instead it was a police action, is going to take part. Once again, we're going to talk about this idea of the domino theory, the fear that if Korea falls into communist hands, then maybe other countries in Asia would do the same. The main leaders is Kim Il-sung, a leader of North Korea, and Syngman Rhee, the president of South Korea. And I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing those names wrong. In June of 1950, North Korea is going to invade South Korea, hoping to gain control of the entire peninsula. The United Nations is going to get involved, saying that this was an unjust move. MacArthur is going to be put in command of UN forces. Now, the communists are successfully going to push UN forces to the brink of defeat. Look at the map on the right. You see the little yellow corner down at the bottom right of South Korea? That's how far the communists got into South Korea. They almost had control of the entire peninsula. But under the command of MacArthur, the UN forces are going to start pushing the North Korean forces back towards the northern border. At that point, China is going to enter the war. Previously, it had just been between North and South Korea and the UN. But now China is involved, and North Korea will start pushing back. We actually almost had the North Koreans pushed all the way back to the Korea-China border. But when China enters the war, they're going to start pushing back. That's going to give them more power. At this point, MacArthur is going to call for the invasion of China. In fact, he goes to Truman and says, I want to use the atomic bomb. This will stop the Chinese movement into North Korea. Truman says no. MacArthur is going to publicly criticize the President of the United States because he said he wanted to limit the war. He didn't want victory. Because of this, MacArthur is going to be fired. However, when he comes back to America, he is still seen as a hero. The war is actually going to end in a stalemate. Picture it. We kept pushing each other back and forth until finally we realized neither one of us is going to win. An armistice is going to be called in July of 1943, ending the Korean War. Korea was divided along the 38th parallel, where it remains divided today. But the war marked a turning point in the Cold War in that the United States saw the need to start increasing the size of our military, all for the purpose of stopping the spread of communism. And that's why Korea is so important. Though no one won and no one lost, what we realized was this was going to be a tougher fight than just saying, hey, don't let communism spread or we'll get involved. Because we'll find that the communists are not going to back down. So there you have it. A quick overview of the Cold War going into the 1950s. And guys, we're just beginning. Korea was just a glimpse of where this Cold War was going to take us. So hopefully you learned a little bit more about the Cold War and have some more knowledge going forward as we start to talk about Eisenhower and his administration and how he will deal with this rising threat from communism. But for now, if you missed anything, you can always go back and watch again. If you saw something you liked, go ahead and like the video. And as always, I'm going to ask you to subscribe. But other than that, I thank you for watching. We'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.